There's no such thing as an objective best heart cut in pot still whiskey. No. This is a nerdy video, so just saddle up. If it helps, later I'm going to drink Belle Meade bourbon and talk about it, and this is the port cask one. But this is for the nerds, the whiskey nerds who are obsessed with super high minutia about distillation. I'm not going to apologize because I'm one of those nerds and I think it's interesting. And since I'm the one on this YouTube channel, I get to do that. Now first, there was a Whiskey Tribe episode dated December 2nd, Saturday, December 2nd, where they did a great job visually and, explanation-wise, of sort of giving you an explanation of what is heart cuts on a pot still whiskey and why it matters and why you would choose certain cuts. So I'm going to do a really fast version of that. If you want a really well done, elaborate version of why hearts, watch that one, Whiskey Tribe, December 2nd. Now, when your pot distillation is, and I'm going to do a synopsis version. When you're doing pot distillation, everything's based on evaporation. So you fill a tank with, let's say, beer or a wash, and it's 10% alcohol, and you start heating it up, and different chemicals in there have different boiling points. And so as it starts evaporating, it collects, and then you recondense it, and then stuff starts coming off of your spirit safe or off the still. Really high proof and then lower and lower and lower, and it's all different chemicals. And so your cuts are based on the first things coming off a still you may not necessarily want, you don't want. And so you put those in one receiver, and then you're checking nose and checking palate and checking proof. And as it gets down to where the things that are evaporating are things you want, you start keeping, you move it over, bam. That's the beginning of the heart cut. And then it changes over the life of that heart cut, over, hours. What you get changes, and all of that goes into one container, and it's a conglomeration, amalgamation of all of the different things that have been evaporating over a range. And then as it starts to get lower and lower and lower, you get down into the 130s and or lower in proof, 120s, you start getting what's called tails notes, which is the higher boiling point chemicals that have all of these big, heavy, weighty, oily notes to them. And you want some of those because they add flavor, but you don't want all of them because they taste like crap. So you want to make the decision on when to stop, right? And so you, at some point, you're nosing, you're tasting, and you go, that's it, boom. And you move it over. Now that tank is collecting tails. So heads and foreshots, hearts, tails. Hearts is what you put into the barrel, right? And then almost all distilleries, actually, take the heads and tails, recombine them and put them back into another run. Some distilleries recombine them like Crowded Barrel and only redistill the heads and tails, and that's called a Queen's run. And like I said, this is so nerdy, but I'm not, it is what it is. Here's the thing most people don't talk about, and we're going to talk about it, and that is there is no such thing as objectively a good heart cut. There is only what is the right heart cut for what you plan to make? Now first, Belle Meade cognac cask. So Belle Meade, we don't know entirely what is in this one, but this is the Greenbrier Distillery. I think it was 30% rye. This is a high rye bourbon, and they put it into cognac casks. Now that is not as common as sherry and types of sherry or port. A cognac cask, which, remember, cognac is in the brandy family, but it comes from a specific region. So this is a distilled barrel-aged spirit already, right? Cognac is. And so the barrels that held cognac held a grape distilled spirit aged in oak. You dump those, you bring them back, and you put whiskey into it. I love that idea because you're not dealing with just a wine, which coats things and a density of things, or sherries where you coat things, but you're dealing with another distilled spirit and its impact on a barrel, and I just think that's really cool. So Armagnac casks and cognac casks, I have had several Armagnac whiskeys, love them. But that's also because I like Armagnac. So, and by the way, this is thanks to Larry Frederick, who is a kind and generous soul. Cheers to you. So immediately, I mean, you smell the bourbon, but you also smell the cognac pretty quickly. As a matter of fact, if I was handed this with no notice, my brain would first say brandy before it switched to the bourbon and the grain notes of corn and rye. That's a strong impact on that cognac. Oh, it smells beautiful. I like bourbon. I prefer Scotch, but because of that, I love finished bourbons, and they tend to be my preferred bourbons. I mean, my all-time favorite one for a couple years ago was Starlight's Sherry Cask Bourbon, and TX, or Firestone Robertson in North Texas, does a whole range of wine cask finished, and so do a whole bunch of other Texas distillers. They're always my favorite ones. So this is hitting in my preferred home plate. Oh, wow. That is a little too candied for me, but it's very sweet. So the cognac accented the hard candy notes that I sometimes find in bourbon and just, boom, shifted it forward. So this tastes like sucking on a hard candy. There we go. If you really push it around and get aggressive, that sugar shell of cognac cracks a little and lets the bourbon through. This is a very desserty bourbon, and I like it, but I would rather have this with like a cigar or something to sort of counter the pure sweetness of it. I don't know what ice would do, but it would be interesting. Anyway, that's an interesting one. Yeah. Thank you, Larry. Okay, so, God, how do I make this not boring? I don't know a way. Okay, so, the right cuts doesn't mean anything. And here's what I mean by that. Say you cut really early, there's some dangerous shit you want to cut out, that's fine, that never goes into the barrel. But if you cut a little bit more early, you get some of these ethanolic vanillin notes that are really sharp and kind of abrasive, but just before they get softened, you know, they get kind of interesting. And they're still a little bit like, ooh, but if you can age long enough, that changes. And then as you go further and further and further, when you're aging, let's talk about aging. When you are aging, three things happen in a barrel. Additive, what do you call it when it's extractive, that's the word I'm looking for, and transformative. So you put spirit into an oak, the oak adds things to it, and that's the char layer and the interaction of alcohol with the wood tannins and vanillins and things. The charcoal layer and evaporation and oxidation extract things from it, and then transformative new chemicals are created from the interaction of the ethanol with the oak. So, and all the other chemicals that are in there. So, if you cut really low into the tails, you have a young whiskey, you're gonna taste tails because those big heavy molecules are the very, very last thing to transform or to extract in a whiskey. And so that's why you can have a young malt and people will say it tastes grainy. It's like, yeah, you're tasting the grain. That the actual new make hasn't had time to extract or transform, and the barrel additive has not buried it, it's just added to it. And so that's fine. That's why smoke, for example, is in the tails, and that's one of the reasons why you can get like a 25-year-old Lafroig, and it's like really mild and not very smoky. Why? Because 25 years in, all those big heavy notes down here, they transformed or they evaporated or they oxidized out. So, say you want that big heavy grain, well, you make your cuts accordingly. But if you have a 2-year-old whiskey, you have to remember that we're going to need to release this at 2. And so we can't just make an objective cut based on what we learned in Scotland or what we were taught in Tennessee, because those guys were making things that could age to 10 or 25, or in Tennessee, 8 to 10 to 12 average, right? And if you're in Texas and you're going to have to, or craft, and you're going to release something at 2, you can't make the same cuts and end up with the same product because you need more time for those things to change. And so you typically, the less time you have, the narrower you have to make your cut if you don't want to have to deal with the off notes that time can fix. The more time you have, the wider you can go to create more flavor profiles that can change and alter. And so often what I find with craft distilleries is that they make cuts based on what they learned in another state or country, in Texas anyway, or even in the rest of the US, And then they make those same cuts on their stills, but then they release a 2-year-old whiskey, whereas the place they learned is releasing 8, 15, 20, or 10, 12, right? Not the same thing. Even if you had the same climate as Scotland, if you make the same cuts and you release a 2-year-old whiskey, well, in Scotland, that's not even whiskey yet. So I say this mostly for people who are making things. Don't forget, you have to cut based on when you plan on using it and how you plan on interacting with it. In Texas, a lot of our people are trying to buy time. And the irony is, when you get used oak and you know that I'm not going to release this for 8 years, and because I'm used oak, you have to change your cuts. Because we know what we made tastes like 3 years from now in these new barrels, but we don't know how that same thing tastes 6 years from now. And it might be it's too simplified and it doesn't get enough character. Well, you're gonna have to add in that character. How? Well, you cut a little lower, add in some of the flavor profiles, but then you can't use that at 3, so you can't get impatient because at 3 that's not gonna be ready. So remember I said this was nerdy. I told you, I warned you. As a consumer, how does that impact you? If you've ever had a whiskey that you felt tasted young, there's not an objective age where 2 is young and 10 is not. There's simply, what did you make, and did you cut so that when it reached the age at which you bottled it, all of your other aging and environmental impacts had developed some things that made it taste, ready to drink. Or did you just make cuts, put it in a barrel, and at 2 years you were like, it tastes good. And then those whiskeys, what you get is either a high or low barrel impact based on the environment and a little bit of grain. And a lot of these crafted distilleries, you get a lot of granola and a lot of cut grass and a lot of grain notes. That's just because technically it's not ready. Unless you're specifically trying to create a whiskey with all of those grain notes in it. In which case, cut as wide as you want and release it at 1-year-old because it's gonna dominate everything. I don't know who that's helpful for, but it was a nerd thing that I find really interesting, and it's the kind of conversation that I have when talking with other distillers and blenders all the time, so I thought I'd bring you in the loop. So if you're still here watching with me, cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here.